Ireland, our beautiful green island with dramatic Atlantic shorelines. Ireland is the land of saints and scholars, a country renowned for its music and literature and for the warmth of its people. But Ireland has a tragic history that lives in the hearts and memory of Irish people.
You have no idea to the extent to which the west and south of Ireland have been totally ruined. There is nobody left.
Members of Parliament and the House of Lords were some of Ireland's major landowners. The Act of Union dissolved the Irish Parliament in Dublin. When Parliament moved to London, their estates were managed by agents. These agents cared only about collecting rents and allowed plots of lands to be subdivided until whole families were surviving on less than 1/3 of an acre. The only crop capable of supporting the population was the potato. The disaster began in 1845 with the arrival of potato blight.
When potato blight struck the Irish potato crop in 1845, this was an unknown disease. We now know it as Phytophthora infestans. It was a brand new group of fungi that had never been recognised or understood from a scientific point of view. This tiny water mould infects the inside tissues of plants. So the potato tuber that gets infected becomes soft. It will germinate the following year, and in doing so already infects the brand new growing plant. But it means the potatoes will not store well, they rot, and the following year's crop is automatically infected by the seed potato that you plant. This in many ways was highly problematic. It meant that it was almost impossible to treat the disease, and all we can really do is slow it in its tracks today.
For the vast majority of people who were totally dependent on the potato, the effect was devastating. The hardships of the famine when Ireland became a country of starving paupers is well documented. In Castlebar, County Mayo, people lay on the streets with green froth coming from their mouths from eating grass. And in Kilglass, County Roscommon, 7 bodies were found lying in a ditch, half eaten by dogs. And in the mouth of one, they found a human heart and part of a liver. It was accepted that the worst sufferers were children. They lay in a stupor. Even in the very act of death, there wasn't a tear or a cry. According to the 1851 census, the population had reduced to 6.5 million in 10 years.
The population of County Cork peaked in 1841 at 854,000. If we go forward 10 years to 1851, it had fallen to 650,000 odd. Now, that means I think roughly 150,000 died and maybe 50,000 immigrated. And our current population is something like 404,000.
There's a common misconception that the famine affected only the Catholics. However, famine was no respecter of religion, race or creed.
A common myth concerning the Great Irish Famine is that it only affected the Catholic community. Recently, historians have become more and more aware of the impact of the Irish famine on Protestants also. Here in Ulster, in the city of Belfast, tens of thousands of Protestant people lost their lives directly and indirectly as a result of the potato blight. Indeed, tens of thousands of people fled into the cities hoping for a better life. It was not to be. For many, cholera, dysentery, typhus and smallpox was what they got as a consequence of crowded conditions. Here in the Shankle graveyard, we have laid to rest between 400 and 1,000 Protestant people who lost their lives here in the city of Belfast. Ireland lost over 1 million people by death through the Great Famine. Ireland lost another 1 million by way of emigration to Canada and the United States. Protestant and Catholic alike losing their lives in the attempt to find a better life.
Despite the deaths and emigration from Ireland, 6 million remained on the brink of survival. Their only hope of staying alive was a soup kitchen and the food prepared in the humble famine pot.
In June 2010, I found an old famine pot on the banks of the Clough River in the townland of Cullenboy, a few miles from Donegal town. The pot had been broken into a number of pieces, but with the help of the local community, we had it restored and placed outside Legany Community Hall. Now, such was the interest in the pot by tourists and locals, we decided to do some research into the famine pot soup kitchen aspect of the famine and try to determine how many of these famine pots are still in existence. So far, we've been able to locate 90 of them.
Well, the pot was a central part of Irish cooking. The traditional homestead had a great big fireplace, and the pot was ever present. So the pot was used for boiling water, the pot was used for boiling potatoes, the pot was used for any kind of cooking that was done, the pot was used even for baking. So what the famine pot was, it was simply a larger version of the household pot. And because it was used during the famine, people called it the famine pot. It got the name the famine pot, and there are quite a few of those still around.
In 1846, the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers, opened the first soup kitchens. They also provided a large number of pots, soup pots they were called, or boilers, and these became known as famine pots. These pots were made in a foundry in Shropshire in England. Foundry owner Abraham Darby sent 56 of them to Ireland free of charge. There was also a number of these pots sent to Ireland by famine relief committees in the USA and Turkey. The pots were seen as an ideal way of feeding large numbers of people. The problem was, of course, where were they going to get the food to feed the people?
The first relief came to Ireland at the end of 1845, and it came from two places, two very different places for two very different reasons. From Calcutta in India, where a committee was formed by English civil servants, and they raised money to show how good it was to be part of the British Empire and the benefits for Ireland of being part of the Empire. Initially they fundraised just among English expatriates, but then the fundraising extended, and I've come across donations from Indian princes, from Hindus, from Muslims, and from really the poorest of the poor in India. At the same time, relief was given from Boston in North America, and the people there were followers of Daniel O'Connell. They were part of a repeal association in Boston, and they raised funds to show how bad it was to be governed by Britain.
There were only 3,000 Quakers in Ireland, but many of them were merchants and businessmen. And through their worldwide contacts, they were able to appeal for help for the starving Irish.
When the crop failed totally in 1846, it was obvious from the outset there was going to be a very severe problem, because first of all, there was no potato crop, and secondly, people had used up their resources in the previous year. So it was to anyone it was obvious there was going to be starvation, and it would start fairly rapidly. So that's the point at which Quakers in Ireland decided to get involved. They called a meeting of Quakers in Dublin to discuss what the possibilities were for Quakers to intervene. Was it possible at all for Quakers to do anything? And the result of that meeting was they did decide to get involved. In the US, the Quaker connections were worldwide. Wherever there were Quakers, there was contacts between them by letter, and so they were kept informed as what was going on within the Quaker community, and that meant that the Irish Quakers and the English Quakers wrote to their fellows in the United States, where they took it on with enthusiasm. And with the sheer size of the United States, they were able to raise huge amounts of food and money and clothing to send over to Ireland.
The Quakers, the Society of Friends, decided to help out, and they got a total of 19 pots, famine pots, which they sent to Donegal by boat, and they took them in at places like Dunfanaghy, Donegal Town, An Mor, and the people then came and collected them. Usually the local famine relief committee would take charge of the pot, and sometimes the landlords helped out as well. And there they would make the meal, make porridge, make soup, whatever it happened to be, and it would be served at a certain time, and people would queue up and get their share.
We know the Quakers' involvement, and they raised money from within their own communities, but also, again, people got to hear about their work and wanted to give. And then the other group that were involved was the British Relief Association that was formed in January 1847, and they were founded by a Jewish banker, Lionel de Rothschild, and they recorded over 15,000 individual donations. Initially, they thought they would just raise money in Britain, then perhaps in the British Empire, but donations came in from all parts of the world, from people from all denominations. They cut across gender, across ethnic origins. So the great and the good. Their very first donor to be recorded was Queen Victoria, who gave £2,000, making her the largest individual donor. They received a £1,000 donation from the Sultan of Turkey. We know it's documented, the records are in the National Library. He wanted to give £10,000, but was told to give less than the Queen, otherwise it would offend royal protocol, so he reduced his donation to £1,000. The President of America, he gave $50, which of course his political opponents told him he was mean to only give so little. So the great and the good became involved. The Pope, he sent money as well. But to me, again, what's most moving is people who had very few resources themselves, who themselves were marginalised, impoverished, yet they sent donations to the British Relief Association and to the Quakers. And two that stand out, one that's had some attention, the Choctaws. They were a group who in 1832 had been moved from their native homeland on what was called the Trail of Tears, and many of their people died on that journey, imposed forced journey, and they sent $174 to Ireland. And in Britain, a group of convicts on board a prison ship, they asked if they could give their own contribution to Ireland, and they raised 17 shillings in pennies and halfpennies, very small contribution by other standards, but in terms of what they had at their disposal, an immense and, to me, a very moving contribution.
All relief that was given by the Quaker Committee to local people to distribute was subject to two conditions, and they were very strict conditions. The first one was that everything that was given must be properly accounted for. The Quakers here were businessmen, and therefore they expected accounts to be kept, not just from a business point of view, but also so they could ensure that it wasn't being misused, it wasn't being siphoned off for personal profit or anything like that. The second condition was that it must be given without any religious distinction and without any form of proselytizing.
It's hard to measure quantitatively, but we certainly know that what the Quakers did in introducing soup kitchens during the famine was vitally important in saving lives, and saving lives in some of the remotest areas of Ireland, because one of the remarkable things about the Quakers is that they personally travelled to some of the poorest places, such as the Erris Peninsula in northern Mayo, and there they set up soup kitchens. They worked with local communities, but they provided them with money, with soup cauldrons, and with the actual food to establish soup kitchens.
Ardus, you hosik you soup kitchen, you Benmullet, August, you initiation defined to in Aitina Ella, Garev, you the soup kitchens Le Foy, and you cross on a Westport House. the bhunig Marcus Austrago, soup kitchen on, agus na cauldrons le fáil de freisin, de déhhir den seach. Agus bhí timppel de suas le cuaig nó 10 míle díine gath ag fáil bíad ón choras seo. Now, nóir feic míad freisin ó heh srígach agus an stáid Lissadal le Sir Robert Gore Booth. Bhí soup kitchens ag a freisin. Agus gach lá bhí sé ag tuairt an fisio seo, an bia seo, suas le 2008 daoine. Agus bhí sé ag déanamh seo suas le cara bhí ag míle 8 seach agus bí 8
Now such was the success of the famine pots in feeding large numbers of people that the British government introduced a further 600 pots when they introduced the Soup Kitchen Act of 1847. By June of 1847 there was 1,850 famine pot soup kitchens in operation, and over 3 million people were dependent on a daily serving of soup or porridge from these humble pots.
When the food was cooked, and that took a considerable amount of time, on a certain day then people would be made aware this food was available, and they would come and queue and line up to get served, and they would bring containers with them in many ways, much the same way as they do in Africa nowadays. You see it on TV, or we're doing the same thing in the 1840s. And everybody got a certain quantity. They usually had a wooden spoon which was very, very large, and it would fill about, a large bowl, and everybody was given a bowl full to take away with them. And a famine pot could feed as many as 1,000 people.
But as the famine progresses, we see a shift in who is actually responsible for relief, and it is local people, who both Catholics and Protestants, who take over the running of the relief system in the town. And this allows for, I suppose, unscrupulous people to become involved in the provision of relief. And it's a feature that's replicated up and down the country throughout the famine. People out to make the most and gain what they can from it. People becoming involved in relief, providing relief for the starving poor. There's a remarkable incident in Edenderry in 1847 where the soup is actually described as poisonous. And what has happened there is people have put in materials which aren't fit for consumption, but they're trying to gain the most they can out of it and make a profit on the soup that they're selling. As the famine progresses in Edenderry, the local Board of Guardians become concerned about the provision of relief and about the money that they're expending. And we have sentiments expressed where the Board of Guardians will not allow any more paupers to enter the town. And effectively what they do is they put up this barrier around the town where any pauper, whether he be starving, poor or diseased, was not allowed access to the town. They actually go to the length of hiring a donkey and cart to cart people off to Dublin, basically shipping on the poor somewhere else and let it become somebody else's responsibility.
The orthodoxy was that people were poor because they were lazy, it was their own fault, and they shouldn't be helped too much. And that really shaped famine policies after 1845. And I think unfortunately there are still people in the world today who subscribe to those policies, that people are poor because they are lazy, they're therefore undeserving, and nothing can be done really to help them. And I think it's a very dangerous philosophy. To me, it's an uncaring philosophy. And I think the famine shows us that it's a misguided philosophy. So I think we can learn, because unfortunately we still have poverty, hunger and famine in the world today, in a world in which there is plenty.
The government-funded soup kitchens closed in October 1847, but a great number of the famine pots remained in use until the latter stages of the famine. There is no doubt that the famine pots played a vital role during the worst years of the famine, and indeed the death rate would have been much greater were it not for the famine pots.
I think the famine pots, to me, they have sort of an overused term, but they have an iconic status because they represent an attempt to keep people alive and an attempt to keep people alive with true dignity. I think that's one of the key features of the role of the Quakers, the British Relief Association, etc. It was given without judgment. So much of the government relief was given in a very begrudging way, and a way in which told the poor people that it was their fault that they were suffering. But private charity, I do believe, gave dignity, and if anything, the soup pots really symbolised that giving of charity without expecting anything in return and without degrading the people who were the recipients of that charity.
The famine pots are a reminder to the present and future generation of that grim period in our history, when 1 million people died of starvation or famine-related disease, and 1 million plus were forced to emigrate, many of them to die on the coffin ships, bearing them to the land of freedom. It has been said, if it had been possible to lay a slab to every Irish person who died at sea during the famine years, one could walk dry-shod to America.
The song Dear Old Skibbereen was written as from the perspective of somebody abroad whose father had immigrated from Skibbereen. He says, "Oh father dear, I often hear you speak of Erin's Isle. Her lofty scenes, her valleys green, her mountains rude and wild. They say it is a lovely land, wherein a prince might dwell. Oh, why did you abandon it? The reason to me tell. Oh son, I loved my native land with energy and pride, till a blight came over all my crops, my sheep, my cattle died. My rent and taxes were to pay, I could not them redeem, and that's the cruel reason why I left old Skibbereen."